Right now, as you watch this, there are people who live in countries they cannot reach by road, not metaphorically, literally. Their homes belong to one nation, but they are surrounded by another. To visit their own capital, they cross international borders, show passports, and hope the rules have not changed overnight. Some cannot leave at all. These are not islands in distant oceans. These are towns, farms, and neighborhoods where thousands of people spend their lives geographically trapped inside the wrong country. Today, you will see 10 of the strangest examples of borders that broke reality. And by the end, you will never look at a map the same way again. Let's start with the most chaotic border on Earth. Barrel, half Belgian, half Dutch, and that is the simple version. The border does not run along a neat road. It snakes through living rooms, shops, and front doors. There are over 24 Belgian enclaves inside the Netherlands, and inside some of those, tiny Dutch counter-enclaves. Border inception. Here is the part that breaks your brain. Taxation follows the front door. If your door opens onto Belgian soil, you are Belgian for tax purposes. A few meters over, you are Dutch. During COVID, neighboring cafes on the same street operated under completely different rules. Same block, different countries, different lives. How did this happen? Medieval land swaps between local lords were frozen into modern borders. No grand strategy, just old property lines upgraded to international law. And no one has fixed it in over 400 years. Now jump to the Baltic coast, Kaliningrad, a piece of Russia separated from the rest of Russia, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, both EU and NATO members. Historically, Kingsburg, it became Soviet, then Russian, even as the countries around it changed. For residents, daily life is normal. Until you try to drive to mainland Russia. Transit depends on crossing a foreign border, which means permits, customs, and at times extra scrutiny when regional tensions rise. Strategically, Kaliningrad hosts the Baltic Fleet and key military infrastructure, giving Russia year-round access to the sea. It is an exclave where identity, logistics, and geopolitics overlap on every road sign. 1 million Russians living in a territory that belongs to them but can only be reached through countries that are no longer allies. But here is the twist. Let's go to a town that does not belong on the map it sits on. Deep in Switzerland sits Campione d'Italia, Italian passports, Swiss. For decades, daily life ran on Swiss services and currency while following Italian law. A giant casino powered the town's economy. Swiss citizens would cross into Campione to gamble, then return home. Gambling is heavily restricted in Switzerland, so Campione became rich. The town had no income tax. Residents lived like royalty. Until 2020, that is when the casino collapsed financially and new customs alignment ended the long-running loopholes. Overnight, the best of both worlds became a lesson in how fragile enclave advantages can be. 2,000 people who thought they had found the perfect geographic loophole discovered that borders eventually catch up. If you thought that was strange, wait until you hear about Livia. In the Pyrenees, Livia is a Spanish town fully surrounded by France because of one word in a 17th century treaty. Villages went to France. Livia classified as a town, stayed Spanish. Today, a designated road links it to Spain without border checks. But step off that corridor and you are in France. One legal definition shaped an entire community's geography. Permanently, Livia has about 1,400 residents. They speak Catalan and Spanish. They use the euro. They vote in Spanish elections. But if they want to buy groceries or see a doctor, they drive to France. Because the nearest Spanish city is an hour away and it requires crossing that neutral road. For over 360 years, Livia has remained a Spanish island inside France. All because of a single word in a treaty. Now let's travel to North America. South of Vancouver is Point Roberts, Washington, an American town you can only reach by land through Canada. It exists because the 49th parallel sliced the peninsula, leaving a tip on the US side but attached to Canada. If you live in Point Roberts and want to visit Seattle, you drive north into Canada. You stop at Canadian Customs. You drive through British Columbia for 30 minutes. Then you cross back into the United States at another border checkpoint. 40 minutes of driving to customs stops, just to reach your own country. And if you forget your passport, you are stuck. Commuters, school buses, and delivery trucks crossed the borders for everyday life. When the border closed during the pandemic, Point Roberts discovered what it truly means to be cut off, not by water, but by lines on paper. Schools shut down because kids could not cross into Canada to attend class. Businesses collapsed because no one could get supplies. Residents could not visit family in the rest of Washington state. For 2 years, Point Roberts was an island, because of a border that should never have been drawn. Let's move to the Caucasus. Nakhchivan, an autonomous republic of Azerbaijan with 460,000 people, completely cut off from the rest of Azerbaijan by Armenian territory. Nakhchivan shares a tiny border with Turkey and Durand, but it has no land connection to the rest of Azerbaijan. Residents connect to Azerbaijan mainly by air and via limited cross-border routes with neighbors. Its position reflects decades of conflict and negotiation in the region. A population tied to a country it cannot reach by a direct road. If you live in Nakhchivan and want to visit Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, you fly. There are no trains, no roads, no buses, just planes. Residents cannot easily trade with the rest of their country. They cannot visit family without booking expensive flights. Nakhchivan has become one of the most isolated exclaves on earth. But here's the catch. Let's go to Africa. Cabinda, on Africa's west coast. Cabinda is an Angolan province separated from the rest of Angola by the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is an exclave with offshore oil, a distinct history, and supply lines that depend on international corridors. Geography turned a provincial trip into a cross-border journey. Cabinda produces 60% of Angola's oil. That makes it one of the richest provinces in the country, but reaching it from the capital Luanda requires either flying or driving through the DRC. During Portuguese colonial rule, Cabinda was administered separately. It was a protectorate, not a colony. When Angola became independent in 1975, Cabinda was incorporated as a province, but many Cabindans never accepted that. Separatist movements have fought for independence for decades, and the Angolan government has held on tightly, because losing Cabinda would mean losing the majority of the country's oil revenue. So Cabinda remains an exclave, geographically isolated, economically vital, politically contested. Now let me show you a nested puzzle. In the Arabian Peninsula sits Nawa, a village belonging to the United Arab Emirates, but Nawa sits inside Mada, which belongs to Oman, and Mada sits inside the UAE. A nested border puzzle where a short drive can flip your country twice. If you live in Nawa and want to visit the rest of the UAE, you must drive through Omani territory, then back into the UAE. The border runs through desert and small settlements. There are no major cities, no grand infrastructure, just a geographic oddity left over from tribal boundaries that became national borders. Nawa and Mada exist because local rulers centuries ago controlled scattered territories. When the UAE and Oman were created as modern nations, those scattered territories became international borders, and no one bothered to fix them. So a village of a few hundred people remains an enclave inside an enclave, a reminder that borders are not natural, they are political. Let's talk about Bissingen am Hockenheim. 1450 Germans living inside Switzerland. Bissingen uses the euro and the Swiss franc. It has German administration but sits inside the Swiss customs area and relies heavily on Swiss services. Life feels binational by design. Two postal systems, cross-border schooling, mixed daily routines. Yet the legal backbone remains German. It is what happens when a border becomes an operating system rather than a war. Residents pay taxes to Germany, but they depend on Switzerland for water, electricity, and emergency services. Children can attend school in Germany or Switzerland. Drivers can register their cars in either country. Bissingen exists in a legal gray zone that works because both countries cooperate. But there is a downside. Bissingen is not fully part of the European Union for customs purposes. It follows Swiss customs rules. So importing goods from Germany is complicated, and traveling to the rest of Germany requires crossing Swiss customs. Bissingen has been trying to join Switzerland for decades, but Switzerland does not want it, and Germany refuses to let it go. So 1,450 people remain stuck in a legal and geographic limbo that somehow works. Here is the twist. Finally, let's talk about Oik, an exclave of Timor-Leste separated from the rest of the country by 60 kilometers of Indonesian territory. When Timor-Leste became independent in 2002 after decades of Indonesian occupation, it insisted on keeping Oik, even though reaching it requires traveling through Indonesia. Even though it makes no geographic sense. Why? Because Oik was the first place the Portuguese colonized in the 16th century, it has symbolic importance. But logistically, it is a disaster. If you live in Oik and want to visit the capital Dili, you have two options: fly or take a ferry. Driving is not possible unless you cross through Indonesia, and relations between Timor-Leste and Indonesia remain complex, so Oik remains isolated, a small piece of a young nation separated from itself by the very country it fought to escape. 70,000 people living in an exclave that represents both historical pride and logistical nightmare. But here is something that will blow your mind. Before 2015, the India-Bangladesh border was the worst enclave nightmare in history. Cooch Behar, 162 enclaves scattered across both countries. 51,000 people living in territories that belonged to one country but were surrounded by another. Some enclaves were just a few acres, others were several square kilometers. People born in these enclaves had no clear access to services. They could not easily vote. Police from neither country would consistently enter. If you lived in an Indian enclave inside Bangladesh, you could not cross into Bangladesh without navigating complex procedures. But you also could not reach India without crossing Bangladesh, so you were trapped. For generations, families lived in this ambiguous status. In 2015, India and Bangladesh signed a historic agreement. They swapped all enclaves. Residents were given a choice: become Indian or Bangladeshi. Most chose to stay where they were and accept citizenship from the surrounding country. It was the largest peaceful territorial exchange in modern history. And it finally ended 302 years of chaos. The Treaty of 1713 between the Mughal Empire and local Bengali kings created a patchwork of tiny territories. When India and Pakistan were partitioned in 1947, those territories became international borders, and no one fixed it for 68 years. Until 2015, one enclave deserves special mention: Dahala Hagrabari, an enclave inside an enclave inside an enclave. India within Bangladesh within India within Bangladesh. Let me say that again. This was Indian territory surrounded by Bangladesh, but that Bangladeshi territory was itself surrounded by India, and that Indian territory was surrounded by Bangladesh. It was 3 hectares of land that belonged to India. But to reach it from India, you had to cross through Bangladesh, then India again, then Bangladesh again. No one lived there, it was abandoned, but it existed on maps as the world's only third-order enclave. In 2015, Dahala Hagrabari was absorbed into Bangladesh, and the world lost its most ridiculous border. So why do enclaves and exclaves exist at all? History: most were created by medieval treaties, feudal land ownership, or colonial mapmaking. Kings and emperors carved up territories without thinking about the people who lived there. They drew borders along rivers, mountains, and arbitrary lines. And when those kingdoms became modern nations, the borders stayed, because borders are agreements layered over older maps, feudal deeds, colonial lines, rival empires. When those layers do not align, reality looks like Baal's Cafe or Point Roberts Highway. No one wanted to give up land. No one wanted to admit their borders were broken, so these geographic accidents became permanent. What happens when you live in the wrong country? You adapt. Residents of Baro learned to navigate double taxation systems. People in Kaliningrad accept that transit to Russia depends on agreements and regional stability. Citizens of Kompioni adjusted to life without the tax advantages they once enjoyed. Families in Kuch Behar finally received the clarity and services they were denied for 300 years. People in Kabinda navigate the reality that their oil-rich province is geographically separated from the nation it belongs to. And communities in Point Roberts discovered during the pandemic what isolation truly means when borders close. These places prove that borders are not natural, they are political, they are historical, and sometimes they are completely absurd. But people find ways to live with them anyway. If this changed how you see the world, there is more hidden in the margins of the map. Subscribe to Locus Key and join us every Monday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Sydney time. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Tell me which enclave surprised you most, and which one deserves a full episode. Drop a comment below. The strangest places are not always far away. Often they are a few steps across an invisible line. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.